Charter to date. I'm really pleased that in September of last year, as part of these efforts as well, within the Interagency Standing Committee, we finalized and endorsed the IASC guidance on environmental responsibility in humanitarian operations. And today's briefing is really an opportunity for us to look at how can we translate policy to practice. And with that, without further ado, I'm really pleased that we're joined today by Bruno Jochum, who is the Executive Director and Founder of the Climate Action Accelerator, Mary Giletti, who's the Deputy Global Logistics Cluster Coordinator, and Andre Krumacher, who's the Vice CEO of Programs, Impact and Accountability with Active. So we will hear from colleagues. Each one of our esteemed panelists will have the opportunity to share their experiences, and afterwards we will open the floor for comments and questions. This is really a great opportunity to hear from all of you in terms of your experiences, any innovative solutions, any great ideas in terms of how you were able to translate some of the great policies and commitments that we've made at the global and the regional and the local level to action would be really helpful. So this is an opportunity to cross-fertilize and learn from each other. But also if you have, of course, any questions, you need any clarifications on how you can do so at the operational level, this is why we are joined today by our panelists. So I'd first like to turn to Bruno. Again, Bruno is Executive Director and Founder of the Climate Action Accelerator. And Bruno, here, I'd like you to perhaps just give us a general sense or a broad overview of the impact that the humanitarian community has in terms of carbon footprint or impact on climate. But then more specifically, I would like you to perhaps zoom in on issues such as reliance. So in many contexts, especially as we are operating in complex settings, it's commonly viewed or assumed that humanitarian organizations face challenges in implementing environmental management practices. So issues such as reliance on generators for power, lack of access to proper waste management infrastructure, amongst others, tend to be viewed as difficult to do in such complex settings that we are operating in as humanitarians. Would be great, Bruno, just to hear your views in terms of how would we address these concerns around this particular issue. Over to you, please, Bruno.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be with you for this session. So first of all, maybe just a word about the Climate Action Accelerator. So maybe some of you don't know us. We're a non-for-profit collaborative initiative focusing on accelerating and operationalizing climate action, especially in the sectors of international aid and health. And we're very much we work mainly around, empowering organizations, turning them into champions, able to influence their ecosystems, and within a philosophy of open community and sharing. So that's just to tell you where I'm speaking from. And we have multiple partners, currently around 25, among which some big NGOs like MSF, ICRC, or smaller national actors in the Sahel. Maybe a word to start with on the responsibility of humanitarian actors, because it is the theme of the day. I think the fact that it's still questioned, although less and less, is quite instructive. And I think sometimes we have to. It's easier to reverse the question, which is, if when we hear the scientific community, which is alerting every year on the dramatic evolution of climate and other planetary boundaries, and asking all stakeholders in society to do their part, is there really any strong reason why humanitarians would actually be exempted from this effort? And I think when we put it this way, it all becomes much clearer. And I think we all have to be aware that in every country there are today, public services which are transforming themselves in almost every field, whether it's emergency medicine in the UK, whether it's rescue services, whether it's fire brigades. All of these organizations are going through this transformation. So it's not something unique, and I don't think that humanitarians can exempt themselves, especially because they are frontline organizations, witnessing the impacts of this change almost every day. And it will, it almost imposes an effort to become exemplary and to actually, transform the practices that are fueling this crisis. And I think that's the starting point. Also, maybe to underline the power of influence of humanitarians, I think it is a relatively small sector compared to others, if you compare it to health or other parts of the economy, but it's a very well connected sector. It has the networks across the world with local communities, national authorities, supply chains, and has a real power of influence in its action. Now, I'd like to show a slide on, we've been working on a sectoral roadmap for the aid sector based on our first experiences, with an estimation of, so next one, with an estimation of what the emissions of the international humanitarian sector could look like. Okay, so this is only very preliminary. The numbers are being under review, but what does it basically say? It says that this sector could represent close to 30 million tons of emissions per year. This is based on 2019, the 3 scopes, which is, roughly, to give you a comparison, it's about the level of emissions of actually the National Health Service in the UK. So, which is the first employer in a developed country. So again, there are many caveats. It's an estimation. We should be able to publish it within a few months with more certainty. What do we see from these initial findings, and this is highly likely to be confirmed, is that almost half of the emissions come from actually the food security and agricultural activities within the sector. So this is it's a lot about food distribution, of course, and procurement. And then quickly afterwards, you're going to find health and nutrition, water and sanitation, and, for example, shelter and NFI. And these 4 key families make out around 80%, very likely, of the emissions of the sector. So it's important to know, where to act. There are also many other areas, but these are the critical ones. Next. If we try to break down, and we've done that based on around 10 organizations, 10 of our partners we've been working with. If we try to break down where are the emissions coming from, and this is an average, so of course, it's not necessarily representative of each organization, but if you take an average of ICRC, MSF, a development movement like Terre des Hommes, etc., you find out that energy is often between 10 and 20% of the emissions. You're going to find supply chain somewhere between 40 and 60. Freight is usually between a few percent to 10 to 12. Travel is pretty significant. It's anywhere between 12 and a little under 30%, and then you have others. So it's really these 3 families where we need to address emissions, and of course beyond emissions you have local degradation of the environment. Now, for all of these areas, there are a number of solutions identified and different levers that can be activated. And of course, we don't have the answer to actually go straight to net zero, but there is a relative good level of robustness on how to halve emissions and what are the pathways to do that, whether it's on controlling travel, whether it's flying less emissive, whether it's reorienting the demand for products and services towards suppliers which are themselves engaged in a transformation, whether it's controlling demand and being less wasteful, shifting from air to maritime freight, et cetera, et cetera. And if we take the buildings and energy side, these are, very, very robust solutions which can be implemented. Okay, so it is a very challenging pathway, but it is, I would say, it's very well identified what are the types of actions to be taken. We should actually be publishing in a few months a playbook for organizations that should be capitalizing on, I would say, the first 20 partners we have, and also others, and what can be the way to do this. Now, you were saying in your question, of course it can be difficult, and there's, these example, can we do without generators in the field in emergency situations, etc. Well, again, I'd like to give you an example which is quite telling. I was talking to an NGO from Burkina not too long ago, and actually what they were saying is that relying on fossil fuels to ensure the continuity of service in a remote and unstable place is actually a liability, because you have price volatility, you have interruption of supply chains, etc. And for them, the question of going to renewables is not about reducing carbon emissions. It's actually about becoming more resilient and autonomous in a very constrained context. And you can multiply these examples, and what it says is that either you take, the same action can be perceived as a top-down mitigation initiative, but it can also be very often understood to be building greater resilience of humanitarian operations, and notably by having less reliance on fossil energy, which is bringing prices upwards. And there are many co-benefits to a lot of these solutions, whether it's on health, whether it's on the local economy, efficiency gains, whether it's on well-being of staff, of communities. And I think the fundamental question humanitarians should ask themselves is, how can they protect and reinforce their ability to operate in a world where constraints are going to become higher and higher, whether it's linked to energy and prices or an explosion of needs. And so it's important to find these ways of actually becoming more efficient and impactful under these constraints, or else it's actually the margins of maneuver to operate which will be curbed down. It's important to have a principled approach in these matters, and I'd like to ask for the next slide to be shown. The humanitarian sector does need a kind of compass for acceleration of this action, and it's made of different references. There's, of course, the climate charter that was signed back in 2021, if I remember well. But we need also implementation principles, and we need generic tools. We need capacity building. We need monitoring systems. Basically, we need now to get closer to the ground on how to do this and equip organizations and the sector in this regard. And next slide, I would like to highlight how important it is to unite humanitarian actors around key principles, because there are still many different practices in the area. So one is, of course, taking responsibility on what you control and can influence, and there are still discussions actually to shed this responsibility in a way. It's about protecting and reinforcing the humanitarian mission, as I said. It's not about deciding to transform at the cost of assistance for populations. It's about quantified targets aligned with science. Now, this is a very key point. There's a big difference in having general intentions of improvement or sustainability and actually having quantified approaches with milestones on how you halve your emissions by 2 in basically a period of time. It's completely different. And obviously, it's the clarity of the target which aligns the organization around these practices. Integrity is critical. I mean, there are some respected standards in this area of work. The greenhouse gas protocol, the fact of not including carbon credits in the calculation of reductions, the fact of measuring all your scopes of activity. Not all organizations are today aligned with this, and this is what makes the difference between credibility and, I would say, improvements, but not as forceful as they should be. Public transparency, integration of the different planetary boundaries, and finally collaboration. So I think all these principles are key. And finally, to conclude, beyond these principles, I think there's a big issue in the humanitarian sector of capacity building. We're talking about hundreds of organizations, national actors, international actors, and it's going to become important to both reflect but organize how this capacity building and accelerated transfer of knowledge and know-how can be made within a few years, and with probably mutualization, collaboration, how also funding agencies are going to review their programming and use their funding to try to promote more climate smart portfolios, and finally adapt donor policies where they need to actually support the transformation of organizations. There are still a number of obstacles which can be worked on, and we'll be happy to share a policy brief following a dialogue with donors that has happened since last year in the month of March, so coming pretty soon. And I'll stop there. Many thanks.
Thanks a million, Bruno. This is super, super helpful. And I like how you kickstarted your interventions talking about the importance of the humanitarian sector and the humanitarian organizations to lead by example in reducing our environmental footprint and being more environmentally responsible and sustainable. And thanks again also for giving us a bit of a teaser, just giving a sense of how we are faring per sector when it comes to emissions and carbon footprint, and you spoke about again, with the chart that you've shared, with food security and agriculture being on top, followed by WASH, health, nutrition, and so on. So this is really a good actually leeway to take us to a question that I'll direct to Mary, who's the Deputy Global Logistics Cluster Coordinator. And Mary's been working in the humanitarian sector for nearly 15 years now, and most of the time really has spent in logistics and procurement roles, largely in Africa and in the Middle East. So Mary, just turning to you, it would be great to hear from you as an IASC mandated cluster, which also has a dedicated environmental sustainability project in your portfolio. How does the Global Logistics Cluster incorporate environmental responsibility among its partners and share responsibility among cluster leads? Over to you, please, Mary.
Thanks, Mirvat. If you'll allow me, I might just take a little step back to talk about the impact of supply chains in general on the environment. And I think we saw from the breakdowns that Bruno was able to share there, so energy, goods and services, freight and travel, this for many of the partner organizations is all part of the supply chain that they're looking after that supports each sectoral area. And I think for me, we want to establish, very basically, what are the problems we're talking about? We're talking about waste and we're talking about emissions. And I think some of these are related to the sort of the sectoral way that we work, and so some things slip between the cracks. Waste is one that comes out as, it's quite obvious, but we don't necessarily assign responsibilities or even, think about actions to combat waste. People are very focused on, as they should be, on the implementation of assistance. But for example, the current case that we have, we're talking about the situation in Gaza. We're delivering water as we should be. We should be delivering clean water to people who don't have it. Because of the context, we're delivering it in plastic bottles. A very low estimate in the first 3 months of the emergency, somewhere in the region of over 10.5 million bottles of water were supplied to meet the drinking water, the absolute critical drinking water needs of the population. Combined with the lack of fuel for waste management and removal, means that at least 70% of all the waste, not just the plastic bottles, but all the waste generated is not being collected. So now we're, sort of creating medium, short to medium, and even longer term problems. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing that. Of course, we should be doing that. And I'm not saying we should ask the cluster coordinators in Gaza or in Jerusalem to do something about it now, but can we learn a lesson and plan ahead for the next time in this situation? The actions that we would take are X, Y, Z, so that the next time we're able to do it without thinking. Talking about emissions, not sure if everybody in the call would be familiar with what we're focusing on as the Scope 3 emissions from the supply chain. That's the ones that are indirect and a little bit hard to measure, traditionally speaking. The result of activities that are not necessarily related directly to your organization, but end up and down the supply chain. So examples might include things we kind of know about or a bit familiar with, the emissions from your business travel. Everybody's quite familiar with that, the sort of air miles and the carbon offsetting and things. Your employee commutes. Lots of people like to use that as their working from home argument, I think. Waste disposal from your offices, but there's other bits that we haven't really got a handle on. What happens with the goods and services that we purchase, and that means the people who make and provide those services, their emissions. That's part of Scope 3, and that's really challenging, commercially speaking, and it kind of even more for us because of the resources that we have, plus the emissions associated with end-of-life disposal of products that we're using, either for ourselves or that we're sharing with beneficiaries. And just as an aside, from a commercial angle, we know that Scope 3 emissions account for more than 70% of a business's carbon footprint. So we're probably not very different. In potentially even worse, because a lot of the things that we do at a country level might be considered old-fashioned from a business perspective. So what's the role of the logistics cluster in that? So led by WFP, of course, as the cluster lead agency, and with our environmental project coalition partners, which is the IFRC, Save the Children International, and the Danish Refugee Council, we've put this project together specifically to overcome some of these issues. First of all, of course, as a cluster, we know that, like many things, no single organisation can tackle the problem alone. But as an organisation, as a cluster with over 600 partners globally, we think that we're really well positioned to create some movement in this area. We're sharing best practices, information, tools to reduce our impact together. And I guess we came from a perspective of saying, what do we know how to do as the cluster, the partner community? How can we apply environmental thinking to our way of working, or what can we concretely contribute to the issue? And so that's what we're doing within the project and the project coalition, is basic cluster approach. It's coordination. We're avoiding the duplication of effort, wasted time and resources. Examples such as we have a green procurement coordination group that brings together a large number of different working groups. So we're already sort of coalitions of coalitions, if you like, of working groups coming together to deconflict and to say, we're covering this area And somebody else might say, okay, well, then we'll cover this other area, or we can build on your results with this, and to kind of really create force multipliers in that respect. So coordination. Information management, again, classic cluster approach. We're sharing knowledge and best practices. We have the information portal on the Log Cluster website. And of course, everything we do as a cluster is available to all humanitarian organizations by default. So that's, you know, kind of sharing that. And then lastly, responding to common gaps. We already knew from sort of anecdotal evidence, and since have confirmed formally using various surveys, that one of the biggest challenges that humanitarian organizations faced and face is the knowledge gap. A lot of environmental expertise, because these people have, you know, studied many years and so on, and are in high demand at the moment. It can be expensive, and for smaller organizations, they may not have the ability to hire that dedicated expertise. Even as a consultancy, it might be too expensive. You know, supporting with policy review, sharing best practices. So we, within the project and the coalition, we've embedded 4 environmental specialists in waste management, green procurement, circular economy, and greenhouse gas emissions that are available to any humanitarian partner to support them with their capacity strengthening and their mainstreaming of environmental sustainability in their supply chains. It is supply chain focused, I will give a caveat there. And this, you know, more than that, the project is continually pushing to get closer to the ground, again, as Bruno mentioned, reaching out to practitioners at national and sub-national level, trying to support practical change that meets those frontline needs. Like, in fact, the power generation example that Bruno was talking about earlier. And then I suppose the final role of a cluster is that sort of larger reaching out, collaboration, you know, regularly reaching out. There might be some people in the audience who feel like they've been reached out to from us quite a bit, but the idea is to bring humanitarian leaders together to try to tackle the problems that we're facing. Last week at the Global Cluster Coordinators Retreat, we were focusing on, indeed, as you saw, again, it's very helpful to have Bruno speak before me, exactly from the slides, the supply heavy clusters, health, wash, nutrition, food, shelter, CCCM, working together, and we've made this sort of commitment to work together to address issues along the supply chain where either cluster coordinators have a leverage, global or national level, or can add value in things like agreed standards, specifications, discussions on how policy and guidance can also help the cluster staff. The environmental project team have heavily supported the launch also of a call to action at COP28 last year, as a result of consultations among humanitarian logisticians. Firstly, to hold ourselves accountable. I think it's very nice, you know, to have these panels and talk about things, but to really hold ourselves accountable to actually do something. Also, the call to action is calling on key stakeholders to support us with our decarbonisation. We called upon donors, host governments, and the private sector to support humanitarians in our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. I think finally, I would just finish up by saying it's not just about the private sector, of course. It's about coming together as a community to say that we know we are responsible for the impact we have on the environment, but we can also collectively have a sustained positive impact as long as we can work and coordinate together.
Super. Thanks so much, Mary, and thanks again for specifically zooming in on the supply chain aspect, and also even for myself as well, you know, raising awareness around Scope 3 emissions. But also very good to hear about the role of the logistics cluster and the environmental sustainable project that you're working on, and the discussions that also just concluded last week with the Global Cluster Coordination Group to look at common areas where you can push, you know, this issue forward, including in terms of sharing best practices, and also for your offer of support to humanitarian organizations with the 4 environmental specialists that are available to support organizations that need support in this area. So this actually takes us nicely to Andre, who's again the Vice CEO of Programs, Impact and Accountability with ACTED. Because from, of course, Bruno and Mary's interventions, it's clear that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but there's also the fear or the concern that I'm sure a few of our colleagues online have, which is, what do you do if you do not have the resources available and the technical expertise available within your organization? How are you able to make a contribution and become environmentally responsible and sustainable without these capacities and resources? And again, thanks, Mary, for offering, of course, your specialists' support in this regard. But it would be great, Andre, perhaps to come in and just let us know, how can organizations, especially smaller humanitarian organizations or non-governmental organizations, how can they effectively address their environmental impacts in the absence of specialized resources or staff? Over to you, please, Andre.
Thank you, Mervat. Thanks so much for allowing me to speak here and share some of our experiences. Back in 2018, when we decided at ACTED to go green at an organizational level, and when I speak about this, I mean both to what we refer to as the back office, so procurement, travel, fleet, basically how we do things, our operations, and the front office. So this is more what we do, our programs. At that time, we had neither dedicated financial resources nor any technical or environmental experts. So how did we do? First of all, we set a framework, and this was very, very important. The push for more or better environmental management in the organization came directly from the NGO leadership. We had just agreed on a new global vision, the 000 vision, zero exclusion, zero carbon, and zero poverty. And on the zero carbon element of it, we needed to walk the talk. So as a humanitarian organization working in some of the most environmentally degraded and climate change affected contexts, and with populations who have least contributed to this situation, we also had the ambition to go beyond a do no harm approach to an explicitly do good approach. So this in terms of framework. And also we deliberately decided at the very beginning of our journey not to hire actually environmental experts or to set up a dedicated unit or department in the organization dealing with it, also because we had only very limited resources. We took the decision to make environmental management the responsibility of every department and their respective directors and management. And managers, and none of them at that time was an environmental expert, but everyone was curious, and it was clear that with our organizational vision, the zero carbon, we had no choice but to make things happen. So with that framework, practically, what did we do? First, we took advantage of free resources and tools provided by other actors. They can help guide any organization in implementing effective environmental management practices. While some issues may indeed be quite technical, we heard about it. For example, if you do a carbon footprint, including scope 3 emissions, many are actually not, and non-experts can implement them if there is motivation and initiative. I'm speaking about energy efficient lighting, power saving settings, reusable supplies and recycling stations in the offices, but also putting in place a green procurement policy. Secondly, we collaborated with others and participated in local and global networks to seek partnerships, to share resources, knowledge, and best practices related to environmental responsibility. So this included, for example, signing up and supporting the development of the Climate Charter for humanitarian organizations. We started to participate in the EHA network. We joined the Initiative on Sustainable Humanitarian Assistance, Packaging, Waste Management. and a working group on the development of the humanitarian carbon calculator. And the staff who participated in these, once again, they were not environmental expert, but they learned a lot through this, and we got a lot out of this that we could use then in the organization. Thirdly, we put in place a simple and I believe practical environmental policy that aligned with the organization's missions and goals, and we developed some basic metrics to track progress towards our environmental goals. And then very important element, and probably one of the most important ones, is changing staff attitudes and raising awareness among our staff in the field, in the HQ, about the importance of environmental sustainability, and trying to foster a culture of environmental responsibility. It takes time, but the fact that as part of our organization's vision, we had senior management buy-in, if not pressure to say, this helped quite a lot. Linked to this, we set up green squads among our staff, encouraging them to contribute their ideas for sustainable practices and involve them in decision-making processes linked to decarbonization and sound environmental management practices. We also identified existing staff members who had an interest in or knowledge of environmental management, and we leveraged their expertise and enthusiasm to drive the organizational greening initiative. And then we started to implement emblematic but also quick fix green practices, such as solarizing our field office network, using energy efficient appliances, reducing single-use plastics, promoting recycling, upscaling our cash programming rather than in-kind distributions. And last but not least, relatively recently, we set up a pro bono external advisory committee, including technical or environmental experts from the finance, decarbonization, and social solidarity sectors. So overall, looking back over the years, I think you can start small, at least to get started, with a strategic and phased approach, trying to focus on a few achievable goals, and then gradually expanding the environmental management initiative as the organization grows and gains experience. Maybe also to recall, in 2018, when we went on this journey, we were 2 or 3 times smaller than now. And as I said, we had no resources for experts. And then over time, while this initiative grows, you can start to allocate a few more resources and potentially bring in technical experts to enhance environmental management systems. But it's definitely possible, and not everything you need to be an environmental expert. I think it's very important that we all get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, speaking about the importance of leadership, and again, setting the tone from the leadership level all the way throughout the organization, and again, changing the culture to make sure that everyone realizes that they have a role in being environmentally responsible. So thanks again for sharing some very practical examples around how organizations can push forward on their environmental responsibility and sustainability with very little resources and capacities at hand. So colleagues, with that, we would like to open the floor for questions or advice or feedback. So please do post them in the chat box. And I know I'm conscious that we have only 15 minutes, I'm sorry to say, for the Q&A. But again, lesson learned for me to make sure that future briefings are extended beyond the 1 hour point, so maybe an hour and 15 in the future. But maybe just taking advantage of the fact that we have a few colleagues from the donor community. Very glad that online we have Carolina from ECHO, as well as Erica from USAID, And perhaps before hearing from other colleagues, would be great if you can come in and just give us a sense of the role of donors in strengthening the environmental responsibility of the humanitarian sector. Any insights, any advice on that would be greatly appreciated. Carolina, perhaps over to you first briefly, and then we'll turn to Erica and see if any questions come in. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Murad. Thanks so much, colleagues. Nice to see many familiar faces on the call. Welcome, everybody. And to those for whom this is new, I hope that this meeting will encourage your organizations to start the work. And indeed, we should highlight the usefulness of having a guidance at the level of the interagency standing committee that of course, has the coordinating role. So thank you so much for that. It's greatly appreciated. And well, from ECHO's side, I think for those who are familiar with the topic know, of course, that we have a set of minimum environmental requirements that we've had now since last year. Or they've been mandatory since last year, rather. We're in the second year of them being mandatory. But first, I would like to recognize, of course, and acknowledge all those who came before us, because ECHO was very much building on other organizations and other donors' work when we started our own journey about in 2020. So very much wanting to recognize that this is actually a long-standing area, even though the current climate and environmental crisis makes it all the more urgent. But we have lots to build upon and lots of knowledge out there already. And for ECHO, it was spurred on in 2020 because of our EU-wide policy on the European Green Deal, which obliged all departments of the European Commission actually to comply with its priorities. So we actually took advantage of that political momentum to also shed some light on the humanitarian work of the EU. And what we've seen is that definitely, donor requirements, unsurprisingly, do slowly but surely spur on a change in the sector, which we find encouraging. Hopefully also it gives our partners a reason to advocate for internal change, which was also our hope. So those partners that have already been doing work on this now hopefully have a little bit more ammunition, let's say, internally to push more for this, because their donors are asking. And I definitely would like to underline the crucial role of senior managers in this change, which is recognized at the very beginning of the guidance. So this is very, very important. And we saw this with our own environmental policy and the work around it. It really took the commitment of all the senior managers of ECHO, starting from the very top. And like I said, it was a political choice, but still a choice nonetheless, and took this commitment to implement it across the organization, both at HQ and in the field. But ultimately, just as words of encouragement, why this should matter to senior managers, I think apart from all the other benefits that we know, it can lead to greater cost efficiency, despite some initial investments, of course, up front. But overall, reducing the environmental footprint can lead to more efficiency, and actually vice versa as well. If we make our operations more efficient, we are also reducing our footprint because we have less waste by virtue. And there are many other win-wins. So, perhaps using those kind of messages can also be helpful. And just to finish off, because, there'll be also Erica coming in after me, just wanted to say that as donors, we are also working to align ourselves better. So there is increasing momentum on this. We know that there are varying requirements and priorities amongst donors, but we are having these discussions and concrete work, concrete output. So I'll let Erica speak to this more. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Carolina, and again, I think you've it's good to hear that there are efforts to align efforts and requirements from donors in this particular area. But maybe very also briefly to Erica, just to hear your thoughts before we receive a few questions from the floor. Over to you, please, Erica.
Yes, with many thanks, colleagues, and echoing Carolina's great gratitude for this platform that IASC has put forward, and indeed for all of the work of the many of you. Yes, glad to see many familiar faces and new faces alike. So certainly from a donor perspective, we really and truly feel that we have this role to listen to you all, to adapt to ideas and innovation that's coming on a daily basis, such as in platforms that this represents. And really, this is a space that we have been working in for many decades. Some of you may be familiar with our green-based flood minimization partnership with the World Wildlife Fund. Really, these types of innovative partnerships with humanitarian and environmental organizations has been one way that we've been moving towards this space. We've also been able to update the NRC's digital innovation tool in the Nexus environmental assessment tool that based originally on the COBO Toolbox platform, which we certainly know IASC is keen to support as well. We really see that as a very critical tool when we're talking about information at the last mile, at the last kilometer, in terms of how can we get this information when we all have staffing concerns. And frankly, as Bruno and others noted, these are such interdisciplinary issues. We need these kind of methodological tools, for example, like the Nexus Environmental Assessment Tool or the NEAT Plus. I was pleased also to be able to help co-create this joint initiative for packaging waste minimization in humanitarian supply chains. This is based on a foundation of work that we have done for many years with UNEP OCHA, their joint environment unit. And we think that's a really critical place as well. And we're pleased to see, of course, the GLC and WFP's leadership on the associated REC project that really is bringing innovation in those types of spaces. I think we also see our role in partnering with academia, looking at innovation. We have been able to partner with the MIT Lincoln Laboratories, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Lincoln Laboratories, where we helped pilot a prototype for a solar baler array-powered plastic waste baler. So really kind of getting those solutions that others were noting about moving away from those when we're in those off-grid situations, having those solar-powered tools that are needed and that were the basis, for example, of a private sector landscape analysis that we were able to conduct with some of the leaders or from BHA or on this call from our supply chain colleagues. And then finally, I think we also have an important role to play in focusing our environmental efforts and the climate reduction efforts on Indigenous peoples and local communities. USAID had a very robust climate strategy process that we released in 2022. And us as humanitarians were very much in the center, really helping shape those conversations and keeping the focus on those humanitarian imperatives. Bruno, I think I like how you framed it, right? We're at the front lines. We see these coupled climate and environmental risks. And so given that we have development portions as well as humanitarian portions within USAID, we saw that as a really important piece to bring that humanitarian voice and have the focus on our climate ambition to be both equitable and ambitious, to ensure that we're indeed not doing any harm and doing good as our GLC colleagues noted. And then I think I just want to kind of circle back to Carolina with giving great thanks for this concept of donor alignment, and really a large part to her leadership and ECHO's leadership in the space. We were able to come together as a series of six to seven donors in Brussels last month. It's the first in-person event that we've had, and while we're quite keen to keep most of them virtual for obvious reasons for these types of engagements, we really found in this first in-person kind of a discussion, we found that we are frankly far more alike than we are disalike. And I think that there's lots of opportunities for us to kind of move forward from a donor perspective. And again, this was 7 donors total, but we certainly have a list of many more donors that we're going to be engaging with and reaching out to. So we're hearing our partners vis-a-vis Grand Bargain and others that it's critical that we come together as donors. And again, I'm so grateful to ECHO for that partnership. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Erica, and also big thanks to Carolina. So, colleagues, I know we're almost up to the hour in a few minutes. Unless there are questions that you'd like to flag, maybe just to say a big thank you to all of you for joining. I think definitely for me, this was an extremely informative session. So it was great to hear, Bruno, from you with also the charts and the analysis that you've shared in terms of the impact of the humanitarian sector when it comes to emissions. Also the importance of leading by example in our respective roles and responsibilities when it comes to environmental responsibility and sustainability. It was great to hear, Mary, from you with regards to the role of the logistics cluster and how different agencies have looked at the supply chain, and you've shared practical examples on the ground in terms of how we can reduce our carbon footprint and emissions. And it was also great to hear from you, Andre, with regards to what you've done at Acted with limited resources, the leadership role in ensuring that climate and environmental issues are prioritized within the organization, efforts to slowly but surely change the culture and make it the responsibility of everyone within the organization. And as you said, start small with a number of clear, specific targets or objectives and build from there. And again, I'll just to also a shout out to Mary and the offer of support from the 4 environmental specialists that you have within the logistics cluster that are available to organizations. But also we'll make sure that we tap upon the best practices tools on your website to make sure that it informs some of the work that we're doing on the ground. Just to say a big thanks to everyone. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to our donors who also came in to share their perspective. And I look forward, inshallah, to our next IASC briefing. We will be announcing it shortly, inshallah. But very, very, very grateful, and cannot conclude without saying a big thank you also to the IASC Secretariat colleagues, Manti and Merlinda, and also Sheila with OCHA. OCHA and UNEP, just to also highlight that OCHA and UNEP, in close collaboration and consultation with the IASC members, it's thanks to them that we have this excellent guidance on environmental responsibility in humanitarian operations. Many thanks, everyone, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.